Hi everyone, my name is Brian Beach, and I'm going to spend some time today and talk about a new AWS service called CodeCatalyst. I'll do that through the lens of .NET and mix in a little bit of PowerShell, give you the context here. But I want to talk a bit about a new service. This is something that we originally announced back in November at reInvent, which is our big conference if you're not familiar, and it went GA last Wednesday, so just a week and a day. This is brand new, cutting edge stuff here that I have to show you. So let me start. I'll start with just a little bit of background. My slides are not advancing. No idea which direction to go to get my mouse on the screen. There we go. Cool. All right. So again, my name is Brian Beach. I am based out of North Carolina with my family. They are quite a bit older now. I got to really update these pictures. My oldest is now driving, so they made a little bit of progress. And I am the author of a book called PowerShell for Amazon Web Services. This was published back in 2013. I'm not recommending you get it. It's so far out of date at this point that I wouldn't waste time on that. But just to give you a sense of who I am, I've spent most of my career as a .NET developer, doing a lot of work around the .NET ecosystem and SQL Server, a lot of Microsoft-related technologies. I've been now at Amazon for just about 8.5 years, so quite a while, and pretty much a generalist during that time. I touched a lot of everything. And at the moment, I'm the tech lead for our Builder Experience community. So that is all of the people within AWS that are interested in the Builder tools. So things like CI/CD, with the code pipeline, code build, if you've used that, now CodeCatalyst, which is the newest addition to that family, with infrastructure as code, so things like CloudFormation, CDK. If you use CDK, I think there was a session on that this week, right? It's all blurring together at this point, as well as all of the SDKs, toolkits, and things like that. So if you're interacting with any AWS services, you've probably used our .NET SDKs or the PowerShell toolkits and those things. And so we support a lot of that stuff. So that's who I am, just to give you a sense. And let me jump in. I want to start talking. I'm only going to do a slide or two just to set some context since this is a new product. And then I want to just jump in and do a demo, give you a sense of what CodeCatalyst looks like. So CodeCatalyst is this new unified software development platform. Right? A big part of what it does is CI/CD and helps you to manage your the deployment, but it also encompasses the rest of the DevOps experience. So there's project management capabilities built into there. Looking at this is just outlining some of those capabilities. So you've got the basic things you'd expect. The ability, at the top, we'll start with code, right? The ability to write your application, to do application development in what we call a dev environment. So rather than working locally, you can work in an environment that's running in AWS. This has a lot of advantages. Being able to size compute to what you need and bring in things like GPUs and whatnot when you need them. It would also allow you to have a distinct development environment for everything that you do. And so it eliminates a lot of the dependency issues that you've probably run into, where maybe you're running two different versions of, say, it's usually Python when I run into this. I'm usually tripping over two versions of Python. And it's nice to have distinct environments for everything that I work on. But I'll also show you how this can really help kind of codify the configuration of your dev environment so that as team members are coming and going, you can very easily spin up a new environment that has everything installed that you need. So a new consultant joins the team and they've got everything they need on day one. I know prior to being here, I spent a bunch of time, most of my career at an accounting firm, at one of the big 4 accounting firms. And when I started there, it was 3 weeks before I could do anything productive. It was literally the first many days they printed out source code for one of the applications so that I could read through it, because that was the state of working at those days. So the ability to very quickly spin something up, jump right in, and work is great. Then those next few, right, build, test, deploy, those are all the components of your CI/CD solution. The ability to build your source code, put it through testing, and then deploy it into AWS. It doesn't have to be, though. We can deploy to anywhere from CodeCatalyst. And as well as the project management capabilities. So things like managing your issues, feature requests, pruning your backlog, and putting in a Kanban board to track the progress of your projects. And I'll show you all of this. I'm doing this fairly quickly, but I'll show you all of this in a minute in a demo. So benefits-wise, right, this is really about giving you an end-to-end solution to accelerate project setup, so you're not going through that machine-by-machine configuration, automate all those daily processes, things like your CI/CD workflow, and then automate some of the configuration of your environments. So let's jump in. I'm not big on slides. I always hate this part of the presentation. Let's jump in, and I want to give you a sense of what this actually looks like. So I'm already logged in here. This is CodeCatalyst. Okay, touch it again. Yeah. I'm sure I'll regret that in a minute when the screen gets busy. But is that good? Okay, cool. So I'm logged into CodeCatalyst here, and I'm logged into my personal space. So it's just my name, Brian Beach. And you can think of a space as a way to organize a series of projects and team members. So I've got right now just one project in here, which is where usually I'm just kicking the tires and testing things. We'll create a new one in a moment. But to give you a sense of what this looks like, my space could have multiple members. At the moment, there's just one. It's me. I'm an administrator. I have full rights to the entire space. I could add other members in here who are collaborating. So you might do this at the business unit level within a large organization, or maybe you just have one space for your entire organization. Okay. There's lots of other things in here that I'm not going to go into. But the other important one is I have a series of AWS accounts. Again, I only have one here. This is just my playground account where I run experiments and things like that. But I could have multiple accounts that I want to be able to deploy to, so that as I'm building an application, I might have here dev, test, and prod, because I want to have distinct accounts to separate those and keep them distinct from one another. I could also, though, have things like different accounts that are maybe deployed for different customers, or geographically diverse if I wanted to. And I'll show you some of those examples as we dig in. But I want to make sure you understand that this is here. It was already registered, so it's linked to my AWS account. And if we dig into it, there are a couple IAM roles. These are the permissions. This is how we're able to deploy, is using what's called an IAM role. Think of this like your credentials to access the environment. Is everyone, you came to this session, is everyone familiar with AWS and been hands-on with AWS in here, and these things make sense? Okay, cool. I won't spend as much time drilling into exactly what that means. So let's come back to projects here, and let's go in and create a new project so you get a sense of what this looks like. So when I create a project, I've got a couple options. I can start from scratch, and essentially what that means is it's just going to create an empty project for me. Right? I'm going to get an empty repository, and I can spin up my IDE and just start working and put stuff into it. Not terribly exciting. I can also bring my own code. So maybe there's something that already exists out in the world. Maybe you've got a project out on GitHub that you want to use in CodeCatalyst, so you can do that too. Right? And here I would just say, I'm going to go to a GitHub repository and pull that content in and use it within CodeCatalyst. But probably the most exciting and interesting way to start is using a blueprint. And you can think of a blueprint, this is like a template for a new project that I'm going to create, but it's more than just a static template. It's really a dynamic template. It's actually a small application that runs, so it's extremely configurable. I can put in lots of different configuration parameters to tune exactly what's going to be deployed into my new project. All right. And there's lots of starting points, as you would expect. Right? We've got things like, say, a single-page application here. This will handle React, Vue, Angular frameworks for the front end of an app. There's things like serverless applications. This is the one we're going to use in a demo, as well as lots of others. So some more AWS-specific ones. Glue is an ETL solution. There's things like the static website for Hugo and Jekyll. This is the one I usually demo, but given the context here, we'll do .NET. And then there's others that are more like reference architectures. So the To-Do app is really a fully built, rather than being a foundational starting point where you're going to add your own code, this is intended to be more like, let's look at a reference architecture for what could be with a fully built out application. Not that a To-Do application is terribly complex, of course, but just to give you a sense of what's possible. Most of these, though, are foundational, where you're using them as a starting point. So let's drill in. If I grab this .NET serverless application, I can read a little bit more about what that does, and it'll give me an overview of the architecture. Essentially, if you're familiar with serverless applications, right, this is going to spin up a Lambda function that's based on .NET, and it's going to put an API gateway RESTful interface in front of you. That's roughly the pattern that this is going to implement when we do it. They don't all follow, of course, that pattern. It's just this serverless app. And of course, it walks you through the details, like what permissions am I going to need to be able to deploy. I'll do this as an admin in a demo. Okay, I'm going to come in here. Let's call this, I don't remember what I had in. So .NET demo, maybe just to be unique. And here's that account connection that I was talking about earlier, right? I've already pre-provisioned and pre-registered an account here called development. And I'm going to use this admin role to deploy it. And then down below, here's where it starts to get unique to the different blueprints. So I can have a lot of different configuration options unique to the blueprint that I've picked. And in this case, there's lots of .NET variants here. I can do things like an empty C# or F# project. I'm going to go with a simple ASP net core C# function. And I can change other things too. As I said, this is very dynamic, so this blueprint is going to build my starting point, build my project for me. And I can configure all of that. We'll look at another one too later that is maybe a little bit more, that has a lot more configuration options that can get a better sense. And so this will go out and build all the resources to initialize my project. Or we can take a look at exactly what's in there. Okay. So I'll start with the source code. I'm going to drill in here and we'll look at source repositories. There's only one. I could have multiple repositories within the project if I needed it. And in this case, it's created the scaffolding for my serverless function, as you would expect to see. And this looks very much like what you'd expect to see as a .NET development. Okay. Rather than look at it here, though, I'd rather look at it in my IDE. And there's a couple things I could do. I could, of course, clone this repository locally, as you would normally. But I think the more interesting, more exciting capability that comes from CodeCatalyst is this ability to create a dev environment. And so the dev environment is going to run, again, in AWS. This is essentially a container. I'll talk a little bit why I say essentially, because it's more than just a container. We can do quite a bit to configure this. But it's going to launch a container within AWS, and that's where I'm actually going to be working. So again, it's isolated. I don't have to worry about the dependencies on my local machine and the tools that are installed. And I've got some options. So AWS Cloud 9 is our IDE, runs right in the browser. I could click that and it would just spawn a new tab. Or I could use VS Code or any of the JetBrains IDEs listed here. And so I could and will just go with VS Code. So I'm going to launch in VS Code, and now I could, of course, create a new branch to work in, and we could do a PR later. Being a demo, I'm going to keep this really simple. It'll work right in main, because I'm an architect and never follow good policy. So we see a couple things are happening here. One, back in the browser, back here, you can see that CodeCatalyst is launching a new dev environment. So essentially, it's creating this new container for me. It doesn't take 30 seconds. It's probably 10. And there it is. So it's launched a new container for my dev environment. And then I'm not logged in. Sorry. Play again. It's always turn the devil to get one down. Cool. So, let me just relaunch that. Okay, there it is. So the AWS toolkit, that's part of Visual Studio, right? I've installed that in Visual Studio. It sees that there's a new container running a new dev environment, and it's going to set that up. So the work of setting up the SSH tunnel to connect to and do remote development, the toolkit takes care of all that for me, and it looks a lot more seamless when I'm properly logged in. And so I end up now in Visual Studio. My C# extension just never installs properly. And here I am now back in that same project. Right, it's been cloned not to my local machine, but to that container that's running the dev environment that's running in AWS. And you can see I'm just connected to it over SSH and working locally. It feels very much like that local experience, but it's actually running off in AWS. So has everyone played with .NET functions in Lambda a little bit? Let's take a look at what it looks like. I don't see a lot of heads nodding. So if we come into that same source serverless app that we were looking at before, assuming you've done some ASP.NET development in your life, let's go look at this. This is essentially the standard entry point that you would have, right? This is where we're going to create a builder and launch a new ASP.NET application. This is what would still happen if you ran this from the command line, right? If you're doing this in debug mode and running from the command line, you would handle that here. And then these projects also have the Lambda entry point. And this is the entry point where Lambda will call into that same ASP.NET application. Okay, how is this? Is it, I need to make this bigger? Okay, good enough? It's a little blurry, I think, too. So this Lambda entry point, this is where Lambda will call into that ASP.NET application. And essentially, right, the model's a little bit different. In these serverless applications, you're just getting a single request, and it's been pre-parsed by API Gateway, so essentially it's just handing you off, here's the JSON blob that describes what I received, and that gets passed in. And so really the only difference is the type that we're implementing, right? What is being passed into this function when we start it up. And there's lots of different things, right? We can do, it's not just API Gateway that could front this, there's a lot of other ways we could initiate a Lambda function in .NET. Okay. And everything else, though, is pretty much the same as you would expect to see. Everything else is just vanilla ASP.NET. So all of this looks as you would expect to see in startup. And you can see here for simplicity, there's just a hard-coded like hello world here. And so I can say like hello PowerShell Summit. So you know this is unique. And we've got a change here. All right. And then we could do, let's see. I really didn't want to test this. So we could then commit this and send it back. So let's do that. I'm going to go in and commit this change. Maybe. Here it is. I don't know if it's a Wi-Fi that's running slow. That's not cooperating. Oh, maybe it's going. There it goes. All right. Cool, so save that. We'll commit that change, and that'll push it back up into CodeCatalyst. All right, so we make just a simple change, push that back to give you a sense of what that experience looks like. I want to talk though a little bit more about these dev environments and kind of the power and what you can do with the dev environment. So I think what makes this really interesting is if you come into, this is the AWS toolkit that's installed, this is how I would make configuration changes to any of the AWS products, and I'll come into CodeCatalyst here and go to settings. Okay, and you can see that the dev environment is driven by and configured by this thing called a dev file. So if I open that up in the editor, this is the definition for what's happening in this environment. And this is just a pure vanilla dev file. I haven't done anything to it as part of this blueprint in this project. So if we come in and look at it, you can see that the main portion of this is what's called a component. And if you drill in, obviously this is a container, and there's a pointer to a repository where it's going to pull the image from. This one is the MDE, the Managed Dev Environment Universal Image. So this is the development environment that has tools on it for most everything that you'd want to do, generally. One thing it doesn't have, though, that's particularly relevant here is PowerShell. It's not installed here, so Sage, that's not installed. So let's look at how we could configure this to get a sense of how we could use this concept of dev file to configure these dev environments and make changes to them. Just go here. I'm going to copy this in. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to define a new section called commands, and I'm going to add a couple commands that I want to run. So in this case, I'm going to install PowerShell. The first thing I'm going to do is add the Yum repo, Microsoft Yum repo. This is a Linux-based dev environment. And then I'm going to install PowerShell. So I'm going to download the repo file, register that, and then I'm just going to do a Yum install PowerShell. And I can set up these events that run post-process. So essentially, after this launches, I want you to go and run these additional commands for me. Does that make sense? Okay. So I'll leave that for a minute, and let's go back into settings here. Hopefully it has detected that that changed. Yeah, it sees that the dev file has changed, and I hit restart. And it should then go and restart my dev environment for me to process the new changes that have been added into that configuration file. All right. And then, oops, it hasn't restored yet. I'm rushing it too much. So if we give that a second, it will go through and it'll reprocess that file, and then these commands that I've added will be installed. And so what's great about this is a really trivial example, is I could then, once this is done, this becomes part of my source code. This gets pushed back. I can commit this, put it in the source code, and now every new developer that joins the team has all the tools they need pre-installed for it, right? So I can configure this environment with everything that we need. If I bring a new consultant onto the team, maybe, we've probably done things like I have where we bring a consultant in for a short period of time, bring them in for maybe 3 or 4 weeks, and you end up spending 2 or 3 days just getting them off the ground and getting them to the point where they can work. Imagine a scenario where they could just immediately go into the repository, say, I want to work, it spins up this environment for them, and they're good to go. So, right, this is super powerful. Essentially, yeah, there it is. So it's gone behind the scenes and installed PowerShell, or we can reprocess that file. That said, this is a really trivial example still, right? All I'm doing is adding a couple commands. I can do much more powerful things with this. So for example, notice that this component, this container, is an array. Right? It can have many containers here. So I can do really interesting things like add additional sidecar containers. Maybe I've got a MySQL or Postgres database that's part of my application. I can add another container in here that's running Postgres and make that part of it. So I've got a dev image and then my Postgres container, and when I spin up both of those launch. And that's part of that definition. So all of that's coming along as part of the developer experience and making life much, much easier. This isn't unique to us. We did a lot of the original work on DevFile, but there's a site, devfile.io, that kind of lays out all the capabilities that you can do with this. And there's a bunch of other collaborators, IBM, and JetBrains, and a few others that are collaborating on this. If you come into the docs, you can look at some of the different things you can do. So particularly, right, I can do things here under components like add containers and add additional volumes. You can pull in some Kubernetes resources and things into it. And then there's all the command stuff that I was showing you where I can add additional commands that I want to run, and then the different hooks for when they run in the process. Mine was just running on launch, along with lots of other things that you can configure in DevOps. So this is very configurable and extendable, and gives you the ability to codify all the rules declaratively so that you can bring on new developers quickly and keep things moving. Okay, so we pushed that change back. There is another change now because I've touched the dev file. I'm not going to push that back because it was a commit that this simple one that we did. You get the point. Let's come back into CodeCatalyst and sort of keep exploring, get a sense of the rest of the capabilities. So if I come over to commits, we should see here's that initial commit. That happened when the blueprint rendered the project, and then there's the demo. And that was the change that I just made when I was demoing and push. This is the one that essentially changed that string to say, hello PowerShell something, or whatever it is, I've already forgotten. Okay, we did that really simply. I could have done a pull request, of course. I'm not doing that here. And we've talked all about dev environments already, but a few things that I do want to call out. This is a container or collection of containers that's running, and we do manage things like the timeout. So you can set an automatic timeout so that if I'm not actively using it, it'll just essentially put that to sleep. It'll persist memory so that it comes back in the same state you're in, but it'll put it to sleep so you're not paying for these running machines all the time when you're not active. And it'll manage that for you. Next, let's move into CI/CD. Right, this is the automated build capabilities, and the core of this is what we call the workflow. This is your CI/CD pipeline. So in this particular blueprint, it created two. One for a pull request. This is how you would do things like probably run a series of linters and things to look at code quality. And then main, which is when I commit something to main, this is my deployment. This is going to go through and deploy this function for me, this serverless function. And we can see it's had two runs. So 13 minutes ago, that was when I started the project. That was that initial commit that created it. And it ran and pushed that, whatever the original string was, that hello world. And then there was another run here that resulted from me making that second push after I made the change. So we go in and take a look at this. All right, you can see here, I've got this workflow. This is where it's gonna, the screen recognition is gonna start to kill me. I'm trying to look at anything over here. So let's take a look at what's happening in here. So first there's a build and test is running. And so these are generic actions, and I'll talk about some of the different actions being the shapes that make up the workflow. These are pretty generic, they just run a series of CLI commands. And so here what it's doing is, of course, doing a .NET build and building this, and then running a series of unit tests against it. We can go in and look at the outcomes of that. They're not terribly exciting. All right, we see the logs for it. All right, in addition, I can come over and look at the reports, and this is a visualization of the results of that run, right, of the unit test. You can see it here. It's not reporting any code coverage right now. It wasn't configured. If it did, it would also report on code coverage, branch coverage, and things like that. And I'll talk more about some of the report capabilities when we go into edit and take a look. And then second, it does a deploy. And in this case, it's going to install the AWS Lambda tools for the .NET CLI, and then do a .NET Lambda deploy serverless, and push that change that I made up into AWS, into my account. Okay. And if we come take a look at that, we should see all the way down at the bottom this nice URL for my serverless function that it gave me back. And boom, right, hello, PowerShell sub, which you can't read. It's super tiny. So just to prove that this is working. And of course, if we jump into my account, I'll probably look at it also. If I come into here and we go to, I'm pretty sure we can deploy that to Oregon. I think that's what it said when I picked the defaults. Image CloudFormation. That deploy command sits atop CloudFormation. Assume everyone's familiar with CloudFormation. That's our infrastructure as code solution. So we can see here that serverless stack is being deployed, and the resources are the .NET function and then the RESTful API that sits in front of it. And if we come and take a look at it, you can see that here as well. Here's that .NET function running in that. Okay. So that's just a really trivial example. I want to go into edit and give you a sense of what you can do with workflows. So if we come in and take a look at this, the workflow itself is just the YAML file. Right? It's defined as YAML and stored as part of my source code, like everything else here. It's easier to look at it in the Visual Designer, though. I can edit it in the Visual Designer, and then we get a sense of what these look like. So first, the source, this is just being triggered on a push to main, but I could also trigger on pull requests so that I could do things like automate maybe some of my code reviews and whatnot. I could wildcard these branches. It doesn't have to be a hard-coded one, so I could do like feature dash star and capture anything that starts with feature if I wanted to have build new environments maybe for every feature branch. And you can use blob patterns to only trigger when certain things change within the pattern. So we can do things like if you're managing a mono repo with multiple projects, if you have projects in docs, maybe you want to have different pipelines to build those depending on what changes. So you can handle all of that. And then as we continue here, we look at the build and test. We come over to configuration. You'll see first, there's no environment. We talked a little bit about those deployment environments. The build doesn't need that. It's not going to go anywhere. It's just a local thing that happens. And then there are those steps, right? The build and test steps. So these are just generic actions where I'm going to give it a series of commands to run. This one's actually really similar, but in this case, I do have an environment I'm going to deploy. So in this case, I want to deploy to that dev environment that we talked about using the admin role. And then this is the one that installs the AWS tools and deploys it. Okay. So those are reasonably trivial. Oh, I said I'd show you some of the report configurations. So we looked at that report before that was showing us the results of the unit test. This is where that's configured. And so we could add other reports here. And there's a couple different types that I can run. So we looked at tests. We could also do code coverage. We could report on code coverage. We can do stuff like static analysis. So if you're running linters or similar, and you want to look for and break the build on certain types of errors, maybe if there's a security issue or something like that, right? There's a couple different formats that are supported here, and then I can determine the success criteria for these. When do I want to? Under what conditions do I want to break the build and not move forward. So I might say if there's a security vulnerability at any level, I want to know about that, but for bugs, maybe I'm only interested in kind of immediate ones. Don't tell me about all the nitpicking little details that you're worried about. And then last, we can do security concerns. So with anything that can output a serif file, it will support. And so that would be like if you're maybe generating a software bill of materials at the beginning of your build, and then looking at software composition analysis, looking for CVEs based on all the packages that are in that. We can report on that, pick those up too, and we can write rules around when to break the build for those use cases. Okay. For the most part though, this very trivial example is only using these build actions, which are super generic. So let's look at what else we can do with this. The build and test actions, those are the ones where I'm just going to give it a series of commands that I want to run. And then there's a bunch of generally AWS-specific deployment options that are here. So things like I want to deploy to SAM for the serverless application model, ECR is the container registry, push to amplify hosting, CloudFormation, CDK deployments, and a bunch more are all supported here. If there's something else you want to do though, maybe you're deploying to something other than AWS, this also supports most GitHub actions. So I can run just about any GitHub action as part of these workflows. And I could use that to do things that we haven't built out yet. For example, I'll use superlinter in a moment, and we can do a bunch of linting against this. I've used it in demos for serverless framework, and those kinds of examples that aren't AWS-specific things, as well as deploying to other environments. So maybe you want to deploy to an on-prem environment or something outside of AWS, you could do that here using GitHub actions. So let's go and take a look at this. There's a whole series here of curated actions. If you don't find the one you want though, you could just use this kind of generic GitHub action, go to the GitHub marketplace and just grab the YAML definition and drop it in there, and it will use it. These are really just well-known ones that we know customers are using every day. So let me add this, get this out of the way since we've got so little screen real estate. So it's added the linter. I want my linter to run before my build. I don't want to even bother going through the build steps if the linter picks up issues, so let's do that first. I'll set that precedent up, it depends on. And then in here, if you come look at this configuration, it's pretty simple, right? This is just it's just a simple using statement here for superlinter. Probably I should qualify this as use superlinter. It runs like every linter known to man on the entire repository unless you narrow it down. So I probably want to say, I only want to test .NET code, or I only want to look at this folder. Don't run against everything. All right. The other thing you can do, of course, is if you go to GitHub Marketplace, so like if we go maybe grab the serverless or a serverless deploy, you can essentially just come up here and grab one of these definitions. And go right here. I could just paste this in here. That didn't copy, but I could just paste that in here, and it would run that one instead of this superlinter. So validate that and commit it. Run there. So I'm committing this. This is a YAML file as part of my source code, so it's going to get saved back into the source repository, and that will kick off another run. And started another execution of this pipeline, and so you should see in a second or two that this starts executing again. No point really in waiting for that. We talked about environment. Again. Just want to give you a sense of the rest of the capabilities here. So, kind of rounding this out, under CI/CD, we have so far been using just what we call on-demand compute. And I can do, that just means it's going to spin up an instance, it's going to execute this job, and then throw it away. And that can be either a Lambda function or an EC2 instance. Right? It's always container-based, but it's going to run it in one of those two environments. The Lambda function is super fast, it comes up and just immediately starts running. EC2 variant takes a little bit longer to boot up, but you can do a lot more. If you're building container images and stuff as part of your build, you can do that on an EC2 instance. You can't accomplish that in a Lambda function. So, what I can do here, though, is I can set up some persistent machines. So maybe I want a single machine that's always around. I don't have to worry then about the startup time of the tasks as it's provisioning resources for me. And I can also use it to constrain my environment. So I might want to say, well, I just want one machine. I don't want to pay for any more than one machine ever. I don't want you to just willy-nilly spin up things as builds are happening. I'd rather that builds waited. Just give me one machine, and if a bunch of builds happen, just queue them up and run them all on this one machine. I want to know exactly how much this is going to cost me, and you can handle that here. And to give you a sense, right, this will support Linux or Windows servers for builds, and then I can also do Intel AMD architecture, or I can run an ARM 64 build, which will run on our Graviton instances behind the scenes. Generally good cost savings, maybe 20, 30, 40% less if you're running on ARM for the same workload. So there's good reason to build on them as well as use them for your deployment architectures. There's a secrets management capability built in. I don't have any secrets because I'm using an AWS environment. When I'm deploying to AWS, the environment gives me everything I need to handle that deployment. There are other times though where maybe I need a secret. Maybe I'm going to log into a database or deploy something on-prem, and then I need to manage some secrets to accomplish that, so I can do that here. Reports. We've already seen an example of a report. Right, these are those build. This is the build report. If there were multiple things happening, if I were doing unit tests, code coverage, security, vulnerability findings, I could aggregate all that here and bring it all together, and I could look at what happens over time too. We can see kind of trends, what's happening from build to build to build. What are those common issues that we're seeing? All right, and then how are we doing on time here? We've got about 5 minutes left. So the last thing I want to talk about is, let's go create an issue. Issue tracking is that project management capability. So this is the ability to manage your feature requests, your issues, put them in a backlog, prune all of that. We can see there's a Kanban board. Here, there's nothing in it yet, so it's hard to recognize what I got to do in process, in review, and done. This is all configurable. So if I wanted to, I could change those statuses, turn on lots of features here. How do I want to handle estimation? Maybe just t-shirt sizing. I can create some other capabilities. So let's go and actually add something to this. Create an issue. Let's say use MVC. And when I type an issue, these are really rich. It's using Markdown syntax, but I've got rich capabilities like an @ sign will bring up the ability to search. So I could maybe mention somebody in here, like me. And I say, hey, Brian. I could say, stop hard coding responses and use controllers. And I can also mention, do things like mention sections of code, like, hey, go look at this file, right? And then when I get this, it'll notify me, I'll be notified, and it will also tell me where to look, right? Go look in this file, you should be good over here. And I'll just leave that in to do, and I'll set this as, this is medium priority, and this is a pretty small change. I could also use labels to handle things like sprints, and say maybe this is in sprint 1. And let's create that issue. Right, and then once this is filled out, I can just sort of move these things around through the different stages of development. Right, so this brings all of those capabilities together in one place. Cool, so let me stop there. We've done enough on CodeCatalyst. Questions or anything about this?
Yeah. To use GitHub Actions in your workflows, does your repository need to be in GitHub?
No, this one isn't. So let me go back to that. Let's go into that workflow. It may still be running. If you don't qualify that one directly, it should really. Wasn't happy, but no, it doesn't have to be. It can run against any repository. It brings up a good point, though. I didn't really talk about this. If we go back to the space settings, there's a lot of extensibility options that I haven't talked about here that I can configure. So for example, everything we're doing right now, I just kept the source code right in CodeCatalyst. But it doesn't have to be. A lot of the different components are very pluggable. So I could use a GitHub repository, leave my code in GitHub, but still work on it here. And that GitHub repository would show up in the list of repositories alongside my ones that are part of CodeCatalyst. We also are doing integrations similarly with lots of others that will come in the future, right? So I don't have timelines or exact commitments or anything. I'm not close enough to know that, but I assume, the GitLabs and whatnot will Bitbucket and those will come soon. And then it's not just the repository. So the issue tracking capability we can swap out. So if you're a Jira user, you can put Jira in there, and they'll just swap out that issue tracking capability and use Jira, but you're still working day to day within CodeCatalyst. So it's extensible that way. There's other things too that I'm not thinking of. Oh, some of the actions, we didn't look at it. Some of those actions are made by third parties. It's like doing security scans, mend is an option, and others as well too. So I'm looking up. Other questions? Did anyone talk about Code Whisperer at all this week? The other cool thing, right? You can't not talk about like generative AI stuff these days. You just have to bring it up. It's just part of everything we do, I guess. So let's talk a little bit. Code Whisperer is, again, it's been around for a little while. I think that released just about a year ago in preview, and then it also became generally available 2 weeks ago, I think. There's a lot of things have rolled out really quickly. So Code Whisperer it sort of helps you with development, right? So using generative AI to help you in your day-to-day development activities. And so if I were just sitting here coding, it would be making suggestions and offering to help finish things. But the other thing it can do is you can just give it prompts as comments, and it will go and write code for you. It'll just author code for you. So for example, I might say that this is a function to upload a file to S3. Right, and it's finishing that for me. I spelled that wrong. Let me fix that. So S3 bucket, and if I hit this, right, it'll say, okay, I'll create a class, S3 helper, yeah, I'm okay with that, and I hit enter, and then it should say, oh, here's a whole, here's an implementation of that. Whoops. That's not Code Whisperer, that's just me doing it again. So I'm going to do that again. All right, and it fills out that whole function for upload a file, and fills out that pattern for me. So this is an AWS example, but it doesn't have to be. I could do other things like, let's do a function to validate an email address using a regular expression. And fill out that, right, it'll be a class for me, great, I like that one. And then here's a function to validate an email address, right? So those common things, regex expressions are especially valuable to me because I can never remember the syntax, it's miserable. So Code Whisperer will just kind of ride along with you, and as you're working, it's just making suggestions like this. And when you're doing really simple things, like these ones, you just put in a comment and it pops it out. And I shouldn't say simple, these can be pretty complex too, and you can build them up over time. So I might have, maybe this is just a validator class, and I can put a bunch of these in here, just put comments in, and it will just keep adding new things for me. So yeah, I'm surprised we talked about that one. And this is quite a bit. In preview, it only supported a couple languages, but when it rolled out generally available, it's supporting a bunch of languages. So all the ones you would normally expect, the Pythons and JavaScripts and TypeScripts and .NET and Java. But then they added like Rust and Go and SQL and a bunch of others as part of the GA. So there's a ton of them in there now, and it's really powerful. I've had this running for a while, and it's just a game changer for all these things that you would normally be looking up. Right? I would not have tried to do that. I would Google that and copy and pasted it. And it saves you a ton of time just putting these in and let it do it for you. We are right at time. So any questions about any of this, I can hang out. No? Okay. Excellent. Thank you. Good. What? Yeah, that's really rough to look at. All right, great, thanks. I appreciate it.